In the dead of night, as the desert winds swept across Burkina Faso, unmarked convoys moved under the cover of darkness. Their cargo, mysterious steel containers, whispered to be rockets from China, was hidden from the world, but not from rumor. By dawn, the story had already spread across Africa, reaching the corridors of ECOWAS. Outrage followed, threats followed, but Ibrahim Traoré did not flinch. What he unveiled next would leave the region stunned, and the balance of power forever shaken. This is the story of Traoré's boldest move yet, one that put Burkina Faso at the center of the world's attention. Stay with us. And if you find this story as powerful as we do, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe, because more untold stories are coming. Night fell heavy over West Africa. The moon hung low, its pale glow swallowed by a haze of dust drifting in from the Sahara. Along the forgotten stretches of Burkina Faso's dry river ports, a convoy of trucks moved silently, their headlights blacked out, guided only by the glimmer of lanterns swinging in the hands of soldiers. The world slept, but in the shadows, history was being smuggled ashore. Steel containers, long and ominous, groaned as they were lifted from the hulls of foreign ships. Their markings were blurred, deliberately obscured with paint. To the untrained, they might have been farming equipment, construction parts, or mere supplies. But to those who lingered in the silence, the truth whispered like a curse. Rockets. Word traveled faster than light in West Africa. Traders swore they saw Chinese engineers in the port, faces hidden beneath wide hats. Fishermen claimed they were forced off the waters for reasons never explained. A truck driver, bribed with a fistful of francs, whispered in Ouagadougou that something monstrous had arrived under cover of darkness. By dawn, the rumors had spread from the desert to the coast. ECOWAS intelligence listened carefully. Within days, coded messages intercepted in Ghana and Nigeria painted a troubling picture. Ibrahim Traoré, the young soldier president of Burkina Faso, was no longer just arming his nation against insurgents. He was preparing for something far bolder, something that could fracture the fragile balance of West Africa. The corridors of power stirred uneasily. In Abuja, officials slammed fists against polished tables, demanding action. In Dakar, whispers curled like smoke. If Burkina Faso armed itself with rockets, who would be next? In Accra, military advisors spoke of containment, of red lines that must not be crossed. Across ECOWAS, one truth took hold. Traoré had lit a match in a room drenched with fuel. And yet, inside Burkina Faso, the story felt different. To the farmer watching over fields stripped bare by drought, the idea of rockets was surreal, even absurd. To the mother carrying her child past burned-out villages, it was hope in a strange, unfamiliar form. The promise that someone, finally, was preparing to defend them. But for Ibrahim Traoré himself, the weight was heavier. He stood at the heart of a storm, accused of recklessness, of playing with fire that could ignite the region. Allies shrank away, enemies circled closer, and his own generals whispered doubts in smoke-filled rooms. The question that echoed through the continent was as sharp as steel. What was this young leader planning? And when the silence finally broke, when the truth of those shadowed convoys came to light, the answer stunned the world. Because what Traoré unveiled next would not only shake ECOWAS, it would shake the very balance of power in Africa itself. The land of Burkina Faso groaned under a sky that offered no mercy. Villages withered in the sun, crops shriveled, rivers retreated into cracked earth. In the countryside, families boiled leaves in iron pots to trick their stomachs into believing they had eaten. In towns, electricity flickered in and out, pumps sputtered dry, and markets offered little more than dust-covered grain at prices no one could afford. For the people, survival was a daily ritual of endurance. For the world beyond its borders, it was just another poor nation fading into despair. But within this suffering rose a figure both feared and admired. Ibrahim Traoré, a captain turned president, stood young and defiant against the weight of history. He was no polished diplomat, no man of wealth or compromise. He came from the ranks of soldiers who had bled in the dirt, who had seen comrades fall in ambushes, who had buried their dead with their own hands. His ascent was sudden, his rule fragile, his future uncertain, and yet to the weary eyes of his people, He carried something rare, the stubborn belief that their country could be more than a victim of fate. Everywhere he turned, the ghost of Thomas Sankara lingered. Sankara, the revolutionary who had renamed the land, who had promised dignity and pride before betrayal cut him down. His murals still clung to the walls of Ouagadougou, chipped and fading, but alive in memory. Traoré walked past them in silence, as though in dialogue with the dead. Was he repeating the same doomed path, or was he daring to finish what Sankara had begun? The question clung to him like a shadow, and as if ghosts were not enough, vultures circled. The IMF demanded gold, the very gold pulled from Burkina Faso's soil, carried away by foreign corporations, leaving behind poisoned rivers and hollowed towns. Each day, reports piled on Traoré's desk. Contracts signed by past governments that enriched outsiders while his people starved. He pushed for better terms. The response was brutal. Threats, sanctions, restrictions, food imports stalled. Aid suspended. And always, the same message beneath the surface: submit or suffer. But Traoré's answer was silence, and silence carried its own power. Soon, whispers began to travel through the desert winds. Nomads spoke of convoys moving at night without headlights, guarded by soldiers with strange accents. Truck drivers swore they saw crates marked with Chinese symbols. At first it sounded like drunken rumor, but then came the images, grainy satellite shots of movement in the Sahel that could not be explained. Something was being hidden. Something larger than rifles or grenades. The whispers sharpened into a single word: rockets. ECOWAS. Leaders reacted with alarm. In Abuja, Dakar, and Accra, meetings stretched long into the night. Voices rose, fists slammed on tables, threats were made. If rockets had truly entered Burkina Faso, it was not only a national concern, it was a regional crisis. One man's defiance could upend the delicate balance of West Africa. And behind closed doors, presidents spoke with unease. If Traoré could do this, who might follow? Yet inside Burkina Faso, the meaning was different. For the farmer who saw his fields burned by insurgents, the rumor of rockets meant protection. For the mother who had carried her child past smoldering villages, it meant hope. To some, it was absurd. How could a starving nation wield such power? But to many, it was proof that their leader was willing to do what others dared not. In a land where hope was rarer than rain, even a rumor could keep the spirit alive. But the truth was far from simple. Within Traoré's own circle, doubt festered. 3 generals watched him carefully. General Ouedraogo, old and weary, counseled compromise, surrender pride for survival. General Zongo, ruthless and ambitious, saw the rockets as recklessness that would doom them all. General Sawadogo, silent and elusive, shifted loyalties with the wind, never revealing where his heart truly lay. They met in private, whispering through clouds of smoke, imagining futures without him. Some spoke of containment, others spoke of replacement. Betrayal breathed heavily in the air. Traoré sensed it. Every meeting ended in silence too sharp. Every conversation stopped too suddenly when he entered the room. He knew betrayal was close, but he also knew that hesitation was death. He pressed forward, each decision another step on the knife's edge, every move a gamble that could destroy him or transform him. Meanwhile, the suffering of the people deepened. Markets emptied, hospitals ran out of medicine, schools fell silent. And yet the rumors grew stronger. Whispers of strange convoys disappearing into the desert, of underground bunkers being dug, of weapons too powerful to speak of openly. No, one knew the truth. Some claimed the rockets were hidden in the sands, others that they were disguised as construction equipment. A few went further still, whispering that they weren't rockets at all, but something stranger, something only. Traoré and his closest circle could explain. The mystery itself became a weapon. ECOWAS tightened its grip. Sanctions multiplied, trade slowed, border patrols thickened. Threats became ultimatums. Leaders spoke of intervention, of drawing red lines that could not be crossed. But beneath the fury lay fear. If the rumors were true, if Burkina Faso really held Chinese rockets, then every capital in the region was suddenly vulnerable. The balance of power had shifted, and none could afford to admit it. In the presidential palace, Traoré stood by his window, watching the city lights flicker. Each light represented a family, a child, a hope. He knew what the world thought of him, a reckless soldier, a naive dreamer, a man with too much pride and too little experience. They did not understand that every container of weapons was bought with the same cost as a container of food. They did not see that his choices were not between good and bad, but between surrender and resistance. To surrender meant a lifetime of subservience, a future where Burkina Faso remained forever in chains. To resist meant isolation, sanctions, betrayal, perhaps even war. But to Traoré there was no choice at all. For him, resistance was the only path left. And so the mystery deepened. Containers slept under tarpaulins in the desert. Soldiers stood watch with weary eyes. Foreign agents scribbled reports they could not confirm. The people clung to whispers they could not prove. ECOWAS was prepared for confrontation, and Traoré pressed forward into the storm. What lay hidden inside those steel containers remained unknown. Rockets, weapons, something stranger still. It did not matter. What mattered was that the world believed. The rumors themselves had become a weapon, and soon that weapon would force the region into a reckoning it could no longer avoid. Burkina Faso stood at the edge of destiny. Its soil cracked, its people starved, its leader defied the world, and in the silence of the desert, beneath the weight of dust and secrecy, the seeds of a storm were waiting to erupt. The storm was building. The whispers of rockets had already traveled beyond the deserts of Burkina Faso, weaving through the corridors of ECOWAS headquarters, spilling into the offices of Western embassies, and spreading through the restless streets of Ouagadougou. But now those whispers hardened into something sharper: ultimatums, blockades, and threats of war. ECOWAS made its move first. Leaders met behind heavy wooden doors, their voices rising and falling like waves. Some demanded sanctions, others whispered of intervention. In the end, they agreed on both. Borders were tightened. Trucks carrying grain were turned back. Burkina Faso's banking access was restricted. The lifelines of trade that sustained the fragile nation began to constrict. And above it all, a message was carried with cold clarity. Ibrahim Traoré must disarm or pay the price. The news reached the streets quickly. In marketplaces, women who once sold millet and onions now whispered of soldiers at the borders. Men who once traded livestock spoke of warplanes being moved into position in neighboring states. Ordinary people began to wonder what their leader had done. Some cursed his name, fearing his defiance would drag them into destruction. Others defended him, saying it was better to fight than to live forever in chains. The nation was split between terror and pride, hunger and hope. Traoré felt the weight of these divisions with every step he took. His days grew longer, his nights restless. Reports arrived hourly, farmers fleeing their fields after insurgent raids, children dying from sicknesses that could have been cured if medicines weren't trapped at the borders, generals bickering in hushed tones about the sustainability of his path. The young captain who once dreamed of liberation now stood in the eye of a storm threatening to consume not just him, but the entire land he swore to protect. Inside his government, betrayal began to take root. General Ouedraogo argued openly that the weapons, if they even existed, must be surrendered. He claimed survival was worth more than pride, that Burkina Faso could not withstand the wrath of ECOWAS and the West. General Zongo, ambitious and sharp, whispered that Traoré had overreached, that his hunger for defiance would doom them all, and that new leadership might salvage what was left. General Ouedraogo remained silent, shifting between camps, his loyalties cloaked in smoke. Each one carried daggers in their voices, waiting for the chance to strike. But Traoré pressed forward, even as the circle around him grew tighter. Spies were everywhere. Reports of foreign agents infiltrating the capital flooded in. Some were caught whispering to disloyal officers in bars. Others slipped bribes into the hands of impoverished soldiers. The air thickened with suspicion. Anyone could be working for someone else. The palace became a fortress of secrets. And then there were the convoys. Under the cover of night, unmarked trucks disappeared into the desert, escorted by men who spoke little and shot quickly. Some never returned. Others came, back empty, their cargo delivered to locations no one could confirm. Stories spread that underground bunkers had been dug into the sands, that vast steel doors had been buried beneath dunes, hiding the supposed rockets. But when foreign drones flew overhead, they saw only endless emptiness, as if the desert itself conspired to protect the truth. The mystery deepened further when fragments of intercepted communications emerged. A coded message spoke of metal birds nesting in the sand. Another referred to silent fire that cannot be stopped. No one knew if these words meant rockets, decoys, or something else entirely, but the lack of clarity only heightened the fear. Ordinary people clung to the whispers like scripture. Some swore they had seen the rockets with their own eyes, long shadows on the horizon, covered in tarpaulins. Others claimed the weapons were illusions, a story invented by Traoré to frighten his enemies. But in both cases, the effect was the same: uncertainty, suspicion, and tension, thick as smoke. ECOWAS grew bolder. Troops massed at Burkina Faso's borders. Military drills thundered in the distance, a show of power meant to intimidate. Warplanes streaked across neighboring skies, their echoes a chilling reminder of how close the region stood to the edge. Foreign powers whispered advice to ECOWAS leaders: act quickly. Do not let this defiance spread. The memory of other revolutions haunted them. They feared a spark that might set fire to the entire continent. Inside Burkina Faso, the tension was unbearable. Markets grew emptier, hospitals more desperate. Families gathered at night and spoke in hushed voices, wondering if bombs would fall on their homes. Mothers held their children closer. Fathers sharpened old machetes, not because they could fight rockets with them, but because it gave them a sense of control in a world spiraling beyond it. Traoré, too, wrestled with impossible choices. Surrender the rockets, if they truly existed, and reveal himself as weak, opening the door for his enemies both inside and outside. Or hold firm, risk isolation, hunger, and war, and gamble the lives of millions on the belief that fear could hold his adversaries at bay. The desert winds carried rumors of a third path. Some said Traoré was not preparing for war, but for a game of deception, that the rockets were less weapons than symbols, crafted to shift perception rather than destroy cities. Others believed he had already struck a secret bargain with powers beyond Africa, that his hand was guided by forces unseen. No one knew the truth, not even those closest to him. And as the days bled into nights, as hunger and fear gnawed at the people, as ECOWAS prepared for intervention, one reality became clear: a confrontation was inevitable. The rumors, the ultimatums, the betrayals, all were threads pulling toward the same knot. The world was waiting for Traoré to make his move. In the capital, soldiers tightened their grips on rifles. In the countryside, villagers prayed beneath stars. In the border towns, ECOWAS troops shifted in their trenches, eyes straining across the silence of the frontier. And in the heart of Ouagadougou, Ibrahim Traoré stood alone in his chamber, staring at maps littered with pins and lines, knowing that every decision he made could collapse the fragile balance between survival and annihilation. The moment of reckoning was approaching, and there was no turning back. The world held its breath. Along Burkina Faso's borders, armies gathered like storm clouds. ECOWAS had drawn its red line, and now the line quivered with the weight of soldiers, tanks, and drones. In Abuja, in Dakar, in Accra, the language of diplomacy was replaced by the language of threat. Radio frequencies buzzed with coded orders. Pilots sat strapped into cockpits, waiting for the word that would ignite the skies. And yet, for all their preparation, there was hesitation. No one wanted to be the first to move. No one wanted to trigger a war that might spiral beyond control. What if the whispers were true? What if Burkina Faso truly possessed the rockets? What if one launch could burn a capital to ashes before dawn? Inside Burkina Faso, the tension was unbearable. Markets fell silent, streets emptied, homes turned into bunkers. The people had no certainty, only fear and hope tangled together. Some prayed that Traoré would bow to pressure and save their children from destruction. Others prayed that he would stand firm, even if it meant war, because pride was worth more than life lived in chains. And in the palace at Ouagadougou, Traoré stood at the center of the storm. His advisors argued around him like jackals circling prey. General Ouedraogo demanded surrender, his voice cracking with desperation. General Zongo shouted for Traoré's removal, insisting the nation could not be dragged further toward disaster. General Sawadogo said little, his silence sharper than words. In their faces, Traoré saw betrayal waiting to strike, but he did not flinch. His eyes were fixed on the map before him, on the pins marking enemy positions, on the heavy steel containers, hidden beneath desert sands. The night the confrontation began was unlike any other. The skies were alive with the hum of drones, their lights flickering like restless stars. On the borders, ECOWAS artillery faced the horizon, waiting. In villages close to the frontier, families huddled together, holding hands, whispering final prayers. Soldiers along the line gripped their rifles tighter, sweat running down their brows, knowing the first sound of fire could mark the end of everything they had known. Then came the silence before the storm. At dawn, ECOWAS commanders sent their message. Traoré had until nightfall to surrender the weapons or face the consequences. The ultimatum spread like wildfire. Radios crackled it into villages. Newspapers splashed it across bold headlines. Foreign broadcasters carried it into every home in the region. The world now waited for the young soldier president's reply, but Traoré did not reply immediately. Instead, he vanished into the desert, traveling with only a handful of loyal guards. Rumors spread like lightning. Some said he had fled, abandoned his post to save himself. Others said he had gone to personally oversee the rockets, to prepare them for launch. The truth remained hidden, cloaked in sand and secrecy. As the sun sank, ECOWAS armies grew restless. Troops adjusted their helmets, aircraft engines growled, tanks churned soil beneath their treads. Fear gnawed at commanders. What if Traoré revealed something beyond their worst imaginings? But fear also tempted them. If he did not respond, they would strike first. Night fell. And then it came. Across Ouagadougou, power flickered and died. The city plunged into darkness, save for the faint glow of torches and lanterns. Moments later, the skies lit up, not with bombs, but with fire rising from the desert. A column of light split the night, as if the earth itself had opened. A roar thundered across the horizon, echoing into villages, rattling windows, shaking the ground beneath soldiers' boots. For a breathless moment, the world believed the rockets had launched. Panic spread across borders. Commanders screamed into radios. Families collapsed in terror. Children cried in the night. ECOWAS capitals waited for impact, their leaders frozen in dread. But the rockets did not fall. Instead, in the desert, a different truth emerged. The fire that rose into the sky was not destruction, but demonstration. The weapons had been revealed, tall, cold, metallic giants standing against the horizon, their presence undeniable. For months, the world had debated whether they existed. Now, there was no doubt. Ibrahim Traoré had brought them into the light, and yet, the true shock was not their existence, but their transformation. For as the flames died, the rockets stood, revealed with symbols painted boldly along their frames, not the marks of war, but the emblems of Burkina Faso, of Africa, of unity. These were not simply missiles pointed at enemies. They were a statement, a message carved into steel. We are not defenseless. We are not weak. We will not be broken. Traoré himself appeared before cameras that night, his figure backlit by the towering silhouettes of the rockets. His voice carried across radios and broadcasts, steady and unflinching. He did not threaten. He did not beg. He simply declared that Burkina Faso would no longer live on its knees. That if ECOWAS or the West sought to starve his people, they would find a nation ready to resist in ways they had never imagined. The world was stunned. In ECOWAS command posts, generals froze. No one dared give the order to attack. To strike now might unleash chaos beyond measure. To retreat meant humiliation. And so they did nothing, paralyzed by the sight of a poor, starving nation standing tall against them. But the tension did not end with paralysis. In the palace, the three generals, who had doubted Traoré, moved. They met in shadows, plotting his removal. They whispered that his demonstration was reckless, that he had doomed Burkina Faso to isolation. Some spoke of assassination, of striking before his myth grew too strong. Yet their whispers came too late. By the time they acted, the people had already seen the images, had already heard the words, had already begun to believe. Across Burkina Faso, the despair of hunger was momentarily eclipsed by pride. In villages, men raised their fists and shouted his name. Women wept, not from fear, but from the knowledge that someone had dared to defy. Even the soldiers, weary and underfed, felt a surge of strength. The rockets might never fire, might never even be meant to fire. But their existence had already changed the battlefield. ECOWAS was caught in a vice of its own making. To attack risked catastrophe. To wait meant losing control. The ultimatum had passed, and the young soldier president had not only refused it, but had twisted it into victory. The confrontation that night became less about weapons and more about power, less about missiles and more about myth. And in the silent hours after the demonstration, as drones hovered uncertainly above the desert, as soldiers on both sides waited for a war that did not come, a single truth settled over the region. Ibrahim Traoré had made his boldest move. He had turned whispers into fire, mystery into spectacle, and fear into paralysis. The world would never look at him, or at Burkina Faso, the same way again. The desert night gave way to dawn, but the war that had threatened to erupt never came. Along Burkina Faso's frontiers, the foreign tanks remained frozen, the planes grounded, the soldiers restless yet unmoving. The ultimatum had expired, and yet ECOWAS had not fired a shot. Instead, they stared across the border into the unknown, into the desert where the rockets had risen like ghosts in the night. Silence held them prisoner, silence and fear. For though no missiles had flown, the image of their possibility hung in the air heavier than smoke. In Ouagadougou, the streets filled not with panic, but with pride. Men who had once spat curses at their fate now raised their fists to the sky. Women who had buried children due to famine and disease wept with strange joy. Even the starving and the broken found strength in the spectacle they had witnessed. For the first time in living memory, Burkina Faso was not spoken of as weak, not ridiculed as the poorest of the poor, but feared, respected, even admired. And all of this radiated from one man, the soldier president whose gamble had turned despair into defiance. But Traoré knew the battle was not won. He sat alone in the early hours of the morning, his face illuminated by the pale glow of oil, lamps, and stared at the map spread before him. He knew ECOWAS had not retreated out of mercy, but out of hesitation. Their hesitation would not last. The IMF would not forgive. The West would not sit idle. He had bought time, nothing more. And yet, time itself was a weapon if used with cunning. In Abuja, fury burned behind closed doors. Leaders who had promised their people a swift humiliation of Burkina Faso now faced humiliation themselves. How could a small, landlocked nation hold the line against the weight of an entire bloc? How could a young captain-turned-president humiliate men who had spent decades in power? Their generals whispered excuses, their advisors offered scapegoats, but nothing soothed the sting of shame. Still, no one dared to give the command to strike, for the sight of the rockets haunted them. Were they real weapons or elaborate shells? Were they capable of flight, or were they merely symbols dressed in steel? No one could be certain, and in uncertainty lay paralysis. Across the continent, the story spread like wildfire. In the streets of Bamako, young men painted murals of rockets bearing the colors of Africa. In Dakar, students chanted Traoré's name outside universities. In Lagos, workers whispered of rebellion against the IMF, inspired by a boyish soldier, who had faced the world with fire in his eyes. Even in faraway Kinshasa and Nairobi, his image appeared in markets and in music, a symbol of defiance, of Africa unchained. The IMF, meanwhile, moved swiftly to tighten the noose. Gold shipments were frozen, bank accounts seized, sanctions declared. International newspapers painted Traoré as a reckless radical, a danger to stability, a puppet of foreign powers. But the more they attacked him, the more his people clung to him. For every punishment imposed from abroad, there was a story of dignity at home. For every insult printed in Western capitals, there was a song of praise sung in the villages. The harder the world pressed, the stronger his myth became. Inside his palace, the shadows stirred once more. The generals who had plotted against him grew desperate. They saw that their chance was slipping away. that the people's love for Traoré was hardening into faith. They whispered in corners, meeting in silence, planning one final move to unseat him before his legend became untouchable. Yet word of their conspiracy reached the ears of young soldiers loyal to their leader. One by one, the plotters were exposed, their betrayal dragged into the light. Some fled into exile, others vanished in the night, their ambitions buried in silence. For the first time, Traoré was not surrounded by doubt but by loyalty, born not of fear, but of belief. The days that followed became a strange kind of peace. ECOWAS, humiliated, pulled back its forces, disguising retreat as repositioning. International envoys pleaded for dialogue, trying to mend what had already broken. Burkina Faso, though still poor, though still hungry, stood with its head high.
The rockets had never fired a single shot, and yet they had already rewritten history. Traoré walked through villages in the weeks that followed, no longer hidden behind walls or soldiers. He walked among his people, his boots dusty, his uniform
simple, his presence unguarded. Mothers pressed their children into his arms. Old men bowed with tears in their eyes. Youth followed him like a shadow. Wherever he went, the cry was the same. Not fear, not despair, but pride. For the first time, the people of Burkina Faso felt like giants, though their bellies were empty. And beyond his nation, whispers turned into movements. Across Africa, leaders felt the tremors. Some grew nervous, tightening their grip on power, fearing their own people might rise with similar boldness. Others leaned forward, emboldened, daring to challenge old chains. A tide was forming, one that stretched beyond borders, beyond languages, beyond divisions. In Europe and America, analysts struggled to explain what had happened. They argued over whether Traoré was reckless or brilliant, whether the rockets were real or bluff. Yet the answer mattered less than the effect. Perception had become reality. A landlocked country once dismissed as irrelevant now sat at the center of global debate. A soldier dismissed as inexperienced now commanded headlines and strategy sessions in foreign capitals. The balance of power had shifted, not by war, but by spectacle, by audacity, by the refusal to bow. Still, Traoré knew the road ahead was long. The rockets, whether functional or not, were only one chapter. Hunger still gnawed at his people. Insurgents still prowled the forests. The IMF still held chains of debt. Yet in his heart, he carried something heavier than weapons. He carried the belief of his people, and that belief was fire. One night, as he stood once more in the desert, staring at the towering silhouettes against the stars, he spoke words that only the sand heard. He asked himself if he had gone too far, if he had endangered the very people he swore to protect. But then he remembered the faces of children pressing wooden toys painted like rockets into his hands, their eyes glowing with pride. He remembered the old women whispering Sankara's name as though it had been reborn in him. And he realized the truth. Even if the weapons never fired, they had already launched something greater, a revolution of spirit. And so the story closed not with fire raining from the sky, not with cities in ruins, but with silence that echoed louder than bombs. The silence of ECOWAS armies retreating, the silence of the IMF bewildered, the silence of a world forced to take notice. Burkina Faso still stood. Africa had witnessed, and Ibrahim Traoré had etched his name into history. The question that lingered, whispered from the deserts to the coasts, was one no one could yet answer. Was this the beginning of a new Africa, or the calm before an even greater storm? And in the hearts of millions who had watched the night sky blaze with the shadow of rockets, one question burned brighter than all others. Was this the moment Africa broke its chains?